You're listening to the Penteract Poetry Podcast, hosted by Etherin.
Welcome to episode 22. This is a panel episode for the Timglaset Editions publication Judith, an anthology of visual poetry made by women. For this interview, Clara and I were joined by Amanda Earl, the editor of Judith, as well as Joakim Norling of Timglaset Editions, and Johanna Drucker, who provided the foreword for the book. We began by asking our guests to introduce themselves, starting with Johanna.
I've been involved with the world of visual poetry for almost 50 years, which is shocking but true. I started printing letterpress in 1971 and was always interested in format and layout and the relationship between visual structures and linguistic expression. And I've gone on to make artist books and visual poetry for all that time, but also became a scholar. And my first published book was, came out of my dissertation. It's called The Visible Word, and it looked at, visual use of typography in Dada and futurist avant-garde work. And, so I've been involved with writing about visual poetry and poetry in the book format as well, and language in the landscape and modes of reading in relationship to visuality and graphicality for a long time. I teach at UCLA. And I'm in the Information Studies department at UCLA, where I am a distinguished professor and the Breslauer Professor of Bibliographical Studies in the Department of Information Studies.
Thanks. And Amanda?
Okay, I was going to tell you my name, but I guess that's sort of irrelevant. Like, you already have that. So I live in Ottawa, which is Canada's capital. I've been, a writer, sharing my work for 20 years or so. I've been making visual poetry since the early aughts, and I've been publishing, I edit and publish others on bywords.ca, which is a literary website here that publishes current and former Ottawa students, residents, and workers. And then through Angel House Press, I've been publishing poetry and other stuff, including visual poetry, since 2007 or so. And I guess I what can I say? My big project for visual poetry is the Vispo Bible, which both Penteract Press and Timglaset have both published work of mine through. So I started that in 2015, and the goal of that is to translate every book, every chapter of the verse, and every verse into visual poetry. And I guess I'm the editor of Judith, Women Making Visual Poetry, a 21st Century Anthology. That's coming from Timglaset Editions. Ta-da!
Never heard of it. So Joakim.
Yeah. Well, I'm the publisher of Timglaset, and I have perhaps the strangest background of everyone here, because I got into visual poetry around 2014, I think. I was sort of aware of concrete poetry and the history, the 60s history of that movement, but I just didn't click with it before 7 or 8 years ago. And I got completely enthralled by visual poetry, and knew I wanted to somehow add to the conversation.
And I've said before that Timglaset and Penteract have had a strong relationship. We've kind of grown together as presses, from doing leaflets and your zine, and now We're both making a go of it, making full-length books. So it's really good to have you on the podcast finally.
Thank you.
Okay, so where to start?
I guess we've got a lot of ground to cover, and we'll return back to the book a couple of times. But maybe could you, Amanda and Johanna, give us a brief introduction to the idea of Judith and why it's important in the context of women in visual poetry, and why it's important to tell their story. You know, the history of it is so rich, but not really spoken about. And I think that's what you're trying to achieve with this book, perhaps.
Well, So Judith is named after, first of all, it's named after Judith Coppathorne, who's a Canadian visual poet who's been active since the 60s, and she's still active today. She's moved from hand-drawn techniques to using Illustrator, and she's someone who I admire, whose work I admire a great deal. So that's why I wanted to name the book after her. And then the title, I think, is an interesting thing to talk about. It's not Women Visual Poets. There's an issue with that word, visual poetry. There's a lot of issues with it, but one is that sometimes when I talk to women about, the idea of visual poetry, they say, oh, I'm not a visual poet. So, like, it's just like, it's because it feels like that's all you do if you say that. So I thought that, say, making visual poetry would make it a little less intimidating, but also just less, like, it's more active in a way than saying you're a visual poet. Because, I mean, I'm not a visual poet. I'm a lot of things. This afternoon, I was someone who ate yogurt, so I don't know why we have to. So I find that term to be a little restrictive, and just say making visual poetry, then anyone can, it's more inclusive, I think, that anyone can make visual poetry in that way. And then I guess from there, it's a 21st century anthology. So it's mostly featuring women who are currently making visual poetry, but it's also an homage to those of the past, and hopefully it will inspire women of the future. So it includes, I'm so bad at numbers that I can't even remember. I think it's basically, we have the foreword by Johanna, and then we have, and her visual poems, and then we have work, poems and visual poems and statements by, I think it's 23. And then from there we have women from various places in the world. And then we have the two essays, one by Natalie Ferris and the other, three essays, sorry, Natalie Ferris, Fiona Beckett, and Kate Ciclozzi. And then we have a roundtable interview called The Thread Between Craft and Language. We had so many, I did that online last year. We had so many responses that we in order to fit it in the book, we had to we're going to put the whole thing online, but we have several women who took part in that as well. And then finally, there's a list of over 1,100 women making visual poetry. Joakim and I started the list when we were starting to make selections for the book, but we just kept going with it. And it's the whole book is a very, very much a community-oriented book, because we've talked to a lot of different people, and a lot of people have given us references and links and everything from editors of publications to visual poets themselves, art curators, gallery people in galleries, just about everyone. I'm surprised I don't just walk along the street and ask people, do you know any women who do visual poetry? That's my next thing. I think I'm going to just ask people that. So I think it's very community oriented, and the list is something that surprises me every day with all kinds of interesting work. And we have this throughout the process of making the book. We've had this email list where I send out stuff to let everyone know about what's going on. And one of the things I've shared over the past, near 2 years now, is what I call wonders. And basically, these are just different women making visual poetry who I found out about through this list. And so every month or so, share a few emails with that as well. So it's been a great experience, and I'm really grateful to everyone for taking part. I'm really in awe about how much support we're getting. So it's just a really fun and wonderful experience. And I feel like I even know more about visual poetry than I did before. I just to keep blabbing, because you have to watch me because I can talk forever. That's one of the I just today had an essay published over on Rob McLennan's Periodicities blog called "Women at the Vanguard of Visual Poetry. If Only We Had Known, Overcoming Erasure to Make Connections Between Past, Present, and Future Women Making Visual Poetry." Because when I started making visual poetry in the mid-aughts, I was told all over by male visual poets, publishers, editors, that few women made visual poetry. And I still hear that it's hard for them to get submissions because few women make visual poetry. So that really was that was disheartening for me. And then now this great book has come out, Women in Concrete Poetry by Primary Information last year. And it's fantastic. It's 50 women making visual poetry, and it's 50, and it's just so fantastic. I'm learning a lot by reading it. And then I think it was about maybe a year into the research for the book, maybe 6 months, I can't remember now, that I found out about Mirella Bentivoglio, who I would say is my model for not just the book, but for networking with women making visual poetry and artists as well. So she, of course, curated, when she found out about the poor representation of women in the Italian art world, she went on to curate 27, I believe, exhibitions, whichever word you're supposed to use there, for of women concrete poets and artists, and created a whole network. So she's my inspiration. That's enough for me for now, I think.
Johanna?
So, yeah, I'll jump in here. And first of all, it's been fantastic to watch this process and to, become acquainted through Amanda's work with this incredible range of poets who are working now and using visual forms. But I think what I'd like to offer here is just a little bit of a kind of long view in terms of visual and concrete poetry, which are two distinct things. And to sort of say a few things about impediments to visibility for the genre as a whole and for women in particular. Typically, when we talk about visual poetry, if we're talking about shaped poetry or poetry that has a conspicuous graphical format to it, it's tracked back to the odes and funereal verses of antiquity and Greek poetry in particular, where shaped poems were used for memorials and tributes in the shapes of urns and so forth. But, that's one way to think about the history, is to anchor it to iconic works that have a pictorial reference or form. But there's another argument to be made that all poetry that appears in manuscript or inscription or print is visual in some regard. So the question of what constitutes visual poetry and where we draw a line to sort of say, oh, this is visual poetry and this is just poetry on the page, I think is well problematized by Amanda's approach, which I think is to say, how is it visual? What aspects of visuality are at work here, rather than a category, visual poetry? And I think, again, the use of the gerund making rather than being a visual poet allows that kind of flexibility to come into play. So I think that was a really good move. But when we come forward into the modern period, we'll leave antiquity behind and come forward a couple thousand years, we get into the period in which, sort of visual work starts to have a kind of conspicuous presence. We're really looking at the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century with avant-garde movements. And there were certainly many active women designers who are part of the book world, and women illustrators who were using, hand-drawn lettering in the 19th century. But in the early 20th century avant-garde, which was a pretty conspicuously masculinist and not particularly female-friendly environment, in spite of Filippo Marinetti, André Breton, and Tristan Tzara's generous vision of themselves, there were very few women who were involved actively in those movements or kind of seen as significant. But there's some crucial exceptions, and certainly within the Russian avant-garde, we see people like, Natalia Goncharova, one of the major, sort of figures who's doing hand-drawn, work. And we see Varvara Stepanova and in the German context, Hannah Hoch with her collage work that is really beginning to, actively engage with practices that are graphic and visual. But what's interesting when we get into the post-war period, because sort of visual poetry kind of disappears for a while there in the 30s. You have the E. Cummings, who was extremely popular during his lifetime. But it's not a genre that has kind of continuity. And then in the post World War II period, when we start to see concrete poetry define itself in a very specific set of relations between the Neugandritz group in Brazil with the De Campos brothers and others, and the figures in Germany with Eugen Gamringer. And they define concrete poetry very, very distinctly. They want concrete poetry to be like minimalist art, to be work that collapses expression, instantiation, and meaning so that they can't be pulled apart. And that work, which I used to think was simplistic, I now see as fantastically beautiful. And I had the chance when Marvin and Ruth Sackner were both still alive, and they were putting their work on display at the new museum that opened in Miami, and to write the introduction for the catalog for that exhibit. And I went back and looked at that work of the 1960s, and it is as elegant as any other modern architecture, art, furniture, craft. It's fantastic work. But there were, again, very few women. Ilse Garnier was Pierre Garnier's partner, Anna Hatherley, Portuguese, brilliant Portuguese woman. And, so there were women doing work. And if you look at the Monoscope site, you can see some of that work also, curated in that environment. But there are a couple of impediments. One is that you needed to be able to have access to the means of production. And the means of production were often in that 60s through, 90s, before the advent of desktop computers. It was print shop. You had to work in a print shop. You had to be in a print shop, and you could do hand lettering, you could do calligraphy, you could do all kinds of things. But if you wanted to do printed work, you had to have access. And those shops were masculine. They were very male dominated. And when I started making visual poetry in the 1970s in the context of a literary scene in the Bay Area, Amanda and I have had this conversation before. It's like, they just were like, oh, what are you doing? I mean, that is just work that calls attention to itself. It's just so flamboyant. It's so, so you get all these like gendered, commentaries. It's like, you think you can get by just by being flashy, like being, it's like, so very sexist remarks. I mean, they didn't want you to be a poet anyway, but a visual poet, that was like taking it too far. But anyway, so I think that, that women were sort of doubly stigmatized for, on the one hand, it's like, who do you think you are to be a poet? And then who do you think you are to do poetry that has this graphical flair and, visuality to it? And we could take this up as another thematic, which is also that the visual is material, and materiality is associated with, the flesh, and the flesh is associated with original sin. And there we go. There goes Eve. We're just in trouble. Visual poetry is the apple of literature. It's the way to enter into sin. So anyway, I'll pause there.
And women are the Lilith of maybe the garden as well, or the pre-garden.
Exactly.
Visual poetry women.
One other point I want to make before we go on, it doesn't have so much to do with gender, but is the fact that before the internet and digital reproduction and circulation of materials, the reproduction of visual poetry was really difficult and super expensive. Mm-hmm. So this is another issue, which is when we think about the major anthologies, which are the Stephen Bann anthology, the Emmett Williams anthology, and the Mary Ellen Solt anthologies, which were the first three really significant anthologies of visual poetry, with the exception of the great Iliast, Poésie des mots inconnus in 1949. But that's a whole other story. And he wasn't reproducing works that had been in their original formats. But the Solt, Bann, and Williams anthologies do try to replicate works that had originally been produced in graphical form. Well, that meant photographing every single original, and the cost of that was prohibitive, right? If you're going to do an anthology and you're going to re-keyboard everything, that's easy. But I mean, by contrast, but the cost of photography and reproduction, so lots of work just never circulated. We didn't see it. We didn't know about it. We had no way to access it. Unless you knew that there was a thing called the Dada Archive at the University of Iowa, or unless, as in my case, I met the Sackners in the early 80s and they invited me to come to see their collection. And then, it's just like, oh, wow. But you couldn't reproduce it. It was very expensive and very difficult. So I think means of circulation have really transformed accessibility and research possibilities. So again, where Amanda and her amazing project comes in.
So would these works be more one-off more like an art exhibition, limited very much to their area and specific galleries. They wouldn't necessarily, there'd be one-off pieces not necessarily ending up in books, and if they ended up in a book, that was a very special situation.
It's a pretty wide range. I mean, when you think about, there's, you know, typewriter poetry that's being published. You look at the early Bob Cobbing anthology, and it's done on a Mimeo, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, I have a copy of this thing. It's Mimeo, right? So, I mean, artists are very opportunistic. They will use any means of production available. So rubber stamp and, you know, letterpress and letraset, that stuff used to rub off of the sheets. Oh, yeah. And, you know, taking type and putting it onto film and warping it. And, you know, I mean, any set of possibilities. So some things were more like artworks and other things were editioned works that were meant to sell and circulate, sometimes very inexpensively. But again, to replicate those for an anthology, to study them and research them, that was really expensive.
I wanted to go back to something you mentioned, because I think this is something that it's slightly off the topic of the book, but it's something that I think our listeners will find interesting, where you mentioned the difference between, that there is a difference between concrete poetry and visual poetry. You know, I have myself been guilty of using those terms interchangeably. So, Johanna, if you could explain what the difference is.
Well, the term concrete poetry was actually coined by the Neugander's group and the, you know, and Eugen Gamringer and the German group in their, you know, pilot, is it the, I know I'm going to forget the exact name, but it's their manifesto from, you know, the pilot program for concrete poetry. And so they're deliberately defining a form, just as, you know, again, you know, Donald Judd in the 1960s is saying, this is what minimalism is, or, you know, various, you know, artists are trying to define a specific set of practices that are absolutely to be distinct from the traditions of the lyric and the epic and the historic. In other words, how can poetry take on a specificity that is unique to this moment? And the term concrete at the time was also associated with the building material, with Brazil and Brasilia, and with, you know, a whole set of, you know, kind of modern aesthetics that were again, pushing back against the kind of traditions of humanism and the traditions of, you know, leftover kind of, you know, historicism and so forth. So it was an anti-historicist kind of move, even though in invoking Neuganderus, they were invoking Ezra Pound as one of the figures who was very important for them. But visual poetry, again, is a broad, you know, a much more capacious term. And, you know, again, I would argue that all poetry on the page is visual. You know, like, how do we know it's a poem from across the room? Well, it's got line breaks. And then even when it doesn't have line breaks, it's a fancy little piece of prose poetry sitting very preciously on the page. Like, I'm a poem too, you know. And so, you know, there's so many ways that the graphic marks of discourse announce themselves as cues for reading to, you know, to their readers, which is why Dada is so funny, right? Because here's Tristan Tzara borrowing all of this advertising typography and ransom note typography and saying, okay, you know, this looks like an ad, but it's a poem. Or Byrne Porter, who is an amazing, you know, found poet, you know, artist who, you know, did all kinds of cut up work and so forth. So it's just, you know, you can't police language, but you know, and people will use the terms as they like, but the term concrete poetry has a specific historical reference point for its origin, whereas visual poetry does not.
Oh, thank you. I think that'd be interesting to people.
Yeah, I think so. I know I've probably struggled. We've talked about it ourselves before, haven't we? So
yeah. Well, I've used the terms interchangeably, and I always feel bad doing it. There is a difference, but yes. So we're still talking about the history of visual poetry and women in visual poetry specifically. I don't know how far back we should go with this. When we had the idea for the podcast, I thought I get to talk about Soohui and the elaborate palindrome. but maybe that's
Go
going
ahead.
too far back.
Sounds good. Go for it.
Let's hear about it.
Yeah.
A 29 by 29 grid that can be read 3,000 different ways, backwards and forwards, up and down. Just, it's my palindrome obsession here. But it is a visual poem, and it's by a woman, so there we are.
Who
I've got
is
that in.
What year
Who
is
is the woman?
Soohui, a Chinese poet from the 4th century.
Oh, okay.
Era.
And it's spelled quite phonetically, so it's
S-U-H-U-I.
SUHUI. And there's beautiful illustrations of this thing. If you choose to look it up, maybe we'll try and include a link in the description of this podcast.
Yeah, so I've got that in.
Well, I think again, the calligraphic tradition is a place where you would see lots of really interesting graphical forms. And I was going to mention one other thing here, which I don't know, Amanda, this is something I've never talked with you about, so I'll watch and see what expression goes on your face. But and that is the whole tradition of needlepoint and of women's work with thread. Because again, you think about the samplers and you think about the embroidery and you think about the incredible, and it's always been associated with women as a kind of feminized art, and a domestic art, and a handcraft. But, certainly in the Renaissance and in the Elizabethan period, there are all these very elaborately embroidered book covers and so forth. But the notion of the text as, something that is made with, as I say, needles and pens, is definitely another whole arena in which you see women's work in text as graphical.
Well, that's it. That's why we have in the book we have that we have a nice the interview about that, because I really didn't know about that connection too much, but then in the process of looking for women who are making visual poetry, some of them started to come to the like I started to find out about them, and then of course through our great contacts, Joakim and I were calling ourselves the Vispo detectives at one point, because we were undercover, finding out all these people. So we found out about, well, he probably already knew, but I found out about Maria Lai and Amelia Ettlinger and all of these. So that's it. There's a rich tradition, and to me, except for maybe in Poesia Visiva, Mirella Metivoglio's the book that has her donations to the Mart. I hadn't really seen too much in any anthology representing that. Like the Women in Concrete Poetry book has these 2 pieces by Amelia Ettlinger, which I don't think are the any needlework type work. I'm not sure, but they're just 2 pieces there. I think they were more of the typographic stuff. But so there's a lot of that. And the other thing too is there's something right now going on called Craftivism, and that's where you take all kinds of different crafts, but especially needlework, and you make all kinds of different things. You make text, you make slogans and things like that. And one of the people, I want to find it because I have printouts of things here. And in the essay, the interview, The Thread Between Craft and Language, one of the people that we talked to is Kate Dowdy, who's Dowdy, maybe that's how you pronounce her name, D-A-U-D-Y. She's a British visual artist, and she uses basically that practice. She uses all kinds of different things, but one of the things that she does is she also cuts out letters and sews things, and I wish I could find a nice little quote to find. You might have to get the book to find it, because my fingers can't turn the page very well right now. But let me see here if I can see something. The sound of pages turning in a sheet. So it's always something you want to hear on a podcast. Oh, let's see. So she has a project called "Am I My Brother's Keeper," which was an emergency. I was just going to say dessert, but it's desert tent distributed by the UNHCR to refugees. My tent was lived in by 1 year or so by a family from Syria and Jordan, the family of Abu Taim. I interviewed refugees from nearly 70 countries about what they had learned about being a human being from their experience of becoming a refugee, and wrote their words on this tent. It is now being exhibited all over Europe, including at St. Paul's Cathedral, Manifesta, Palermo, London Sacchi Gallery, and being put out in the Spanish national curriculum for school children. So And her motivation is to show that everything is connected, that we can all learn from one another, that our life is what our thoughts make it. So this is the type of thing that we're seeing with, I find, a lot of the embroidery work and the needlework, and also there's for instance, another woman who also she had an abortion, and she makes a piece in response to that. So I think there's a lot that has been going on for a long time with what was called women's work, and even in the art world, it's sort of craft has been often relegated to not being considered to be an art practice, which is, I think, pretty ludicrous. But so I think that's one of the things we're bringing into this book as well, and that's another thing. I absolutely love anything to do with. I wish I could do things like that too myself, but I would love to be able to make some interesting FU samplers and leave them around in various places at times. So yeah, that would be fun. So yeah, I think that's an interesting point about how far back it goes as well. At a time when we were told that women didn't make visual poetry, they were making it long ago. So that's.
Yeah, and it's good anyway, in general, with visual poetry, it's good to emphasize the range it has, that there are so many different materials you can work with. I mean, was that very important to you with this book then, to show that there are lots of different ways to do it? Ask Joakim this, because you haven't spoken for a while.
Yeah, sure. I don't mind taking a back seat. After all, it's a book about by women and about women. So I'm just a publisher. Yeah, that was important actually. In the beginning, we discussed quite a lot how are we going to choose the women to appear in this book, and neither of us really wanted to make that choice. And we ended up choosing 12 women, and we wanted it to be international, from all kinds of places, and we wanted a variety of styles and materials used and so on. But then we I think it was you, Amanda, who had a brilliant idea that we should ask those 12 to name another one, making it 24 in total, which sort of lifted the burden of of having to make the hard choices a little from us. And also it ended up us discovering a lot of new people which we didn't know about. Anke van Dijk, for example, who is in the book. I had never heard of her, nor had you, I think, and there are others too. So that was really, it was both a liberating experience and an experience of discovery.
Yeah, I really like that idea about the book, because it was one of the things I was thinking about, that sort of almost chainmail aspect. You know, yeah. you're in this book, now name somebody else to be in the book. Yeah. And I'd imagine that must be a really lovely way to discover things, because obviously you can go with what you know, which is great, because there's a great variety of poets in this book, mm-hmm. and some I knew, some I didn't know, and the range of what they're doing. But I really like that idea of actually you casting it out to the contributors, say, who else do you think deserves to be in this book? Who else do you know? And that idea of expanding the net and just breaking into people we may not necessarily have discovered in our own little shells of knowing each other. I think that's really wonderful, that idea of discovery. So
I guess it's a way of democratizing the curating of an anthology, because curating an anthology is always being a gatekeeper, and none of us wants to be a gatekeeper. And at the same time, Amanda was the editor and I was the publisher, and we had to start somewhere, obviously. And I think it worked really well, actually.
It's quite interesting just finding out from reading who you knew and who you discovered through this process as well, and what that brought to you. I mean, there must be so many unexpected hidden gems that you've discovered through the process, all of you.
Yeah,
Definitely.
the idea of asking the contributors too about who else they're interested in is also a way to kind of make the point that when there is erasure, when women are made invisible by not being included, what happens is it's also a great loss, because then you can't find out about others as well who can also maybe help give you some ideas for your work or inspire you in some way. And the other thing is, we even ask those who were named to also come up with names as well. So it goes quite far in the you know, and we didn't ask for any cookie recipes, so it wasn't a true chain mail in the way it, but maybe that we should do that at the end. Maybe we should invite cookie recipes. I don't know, but yeah, as far as, I mean, there's so many. There's contributors to the book, but there's also the women on the list. Like, I just printed out one of the wonders that I found out about, that I shared with the group. A woman named Amalia Pica did a series called Joy in Hospital, paperwork series, and it's installed throughout the oncology isolation ward at Bart's Hospital. Joy in Paperwork 1 to 65 consists of a suite of 65 drawings, all made using office rubber stamps, like those found in postal or immigration services. These quirky, playful works poke fun at bureaucracy and the monotony of administrative tasks. And that's from a website called vitalarts.org.uk. So these are the kind of things, like, I'm thrilled. I feel like it's a very active thing. Like, it's like, I don't think that, sometimes I think people think of visual poetry as somehow separate from the world, but it's part of the world. This is a crazy thing. Last year I read a romance novel about a woman who was a maker of, she was a calligrapher, but she also did commissions for people and things. And she met this guy, and they went on a kind of a scavenger hunt through New York City, where they looked at all the signs, and they talked about the styles of the signs. They even talked about font. They talked about Helvetica, for goodness sakes, in a romance novel, which is great. The point is visual poetry is alive, and it's not something that's a rarefied thing. It's part of our whole life. Like, it's everywhere. It's not. I don't think it's as. I think it's a living, breathing thing, and. So that's what I want this book to convey, I think.
Yeah, and I think it does that, because I know you kindly provided me with a sneak peek at it, so we could give our opinions in advance of this interview, and I was left inspired and in awe by the book. I think just to see this scope, because there are things, but to see innovative takes, like the things we're all familiar with, like the letter sets and the typewriter art and things like that, right down to, and the sort of the craft and the collage work. I think one of the first ones in the book, and I'm sorry, I haven't had chance to study and remember all the contributors, but there's one with beautiful things of cut up maps and atlases.
Yes, Vivian.
Beautiful sculptures. And then we've touched on this before, and I mentioned it, all the people, and I have no patience with sewing. I think with the press, we did a couple of sewn leaflets, and I hated it. I hated learning about it at school, but I'm so in awe of the people with the patience to do these delicate sewn embroidered things. Like I said, the things hanging from a thread. Certainly, like, for example, Kate Siclosi with her work, sewing things onto leaves, dead leaves, something so fragile. That must be as incredibly frustrating as getting 2/3 of the way through a typewriter piece and hitting the wrong key. It's this patience and determination with a lot of it that I think I admire, and it's so innovative, and there's so many great things that I think anyone could take it, and if they felt the urge, run with it. And it's that idea of what you portrayed, is that freedom of try it.
Yeah. But Clara, I've seen those dragons of yours. You must have a lot of patience to do those. Those are intricate pieces, digital, but still they are intricate, and I know how much work it takes to do some of that. So that's you don't cut your fingers, so you don't there's no blood on the keyboard usually. That's the difference, I think.
Yeah. And you get Control Z.
Yeah, really.
You can't control Z, a needle and thread.
Yeah, I've tried that. It doesn't work.
Alongside all the amazing Vispo, there's a lot of text still in this book.
I know.
A lot of essays. So obviously that was very important to you as well. That it's you really want to put the context to this.
Yeah, we did. We talked a lot about that early on as well. That we didn't just want an anthology with a lot of visual work, but we wanted it to be in context as well. And I think we had a lot of discussions about which topics and and so on. But I'm really pleased with how it turned out. Actually, I think the essay on asemic writing is really good. It's a great overview, and also Fiona Beckett writes about the future of visual poetry, VR visual poetry, and so on. Really interesting stuff.
Yeah, I like to say, like, one of the things that's been sort of interesting to watch as digital media came online, and you have to realize, like, really, literally, I used one of the first generation computer typesetters. It was called a CompuGraphic, and it was in the mid-1970s. It had no memory. It had no memory. Okay, so you typed, it had 37, letter character display, and you could make the changes within those 37 characters, but there was no storage. There was no record of keystrokes or anything. But what's been interesting is to watch that as desktop computing and personal computing really expanded the range of options at the, really just right there for anyone, that it's taken quite a while for people to engage with visual forms. And that when you think about the incredible conservativeness, of academic writing or sort of conventional writing and so forth, that there's really there's a kind of hard line still between work that engages with the graphical and work that stays on the other side. There's a kind of sense that serious work, really serious text, would not be visual or graphical, right? That somehow, as soon as you do that you are, sort of signaling some other kind of register of the text and its purpose. So it's great to see, from my point of view, this amazing innovation within the use of digital, computational, electronic, and sort of new media environment kind of work. But it's also amazing to me to see how slow it was. I mean, it's 25 years that we've had, the graphical interface on the net, and it's, 35 years that we've had, Apple computers and fonts, so that the term font became a term that people knew, right? In the 70s, when I was setting type, in a literary print shop, people didn't know what the term font was, or what leading was, or what drop caps were, or kerning. And those are not even graphical terms, but it's just the language of graphic design, layout, and so forth just wasn't there. I'm not sure people think so much in those terms, but they've internalized the language of graphicality. But they still have, to a great extent, resisted internalizing the kind of broader range of potential and possibilities of graphical form for poetic expression. And hopefully this anthology and the correlating, pieces that are going with it will serve as that kind of inspiration, not for imitation, but for what I call the internalization of form, so that you begin to think in forms, not simply to, sort of make a text and then treat it graphically, but to conceptualize a text from the beginning within a kind of graphical understanding of possibility for expression.
I think one thing I want to say is that one of the reasons we have for the prose side of it, we have the essays, but we also have statements by each of the contributors in the first person, and we have a selected bibliography as well, which includes their some of their published work and also their if they've done any exhibitions and stuff like that. And there's a few reasons for that. One is, again, the idea of the book as a field guide to visual poetry, but also to women making visual poetry, to help people, to help inspire more work. I mean, you can look at a visual poem and you can get a lot out of it. There's nothing wrong with just having a visual poem on its own. That's totally great. But this book, I feel it's also kind of a work of instruction in a lot of ways. So that's one of the reasons for it. And the first person, I think that adds a personal dimension to the book that's important as well. So that's my.
I picked up on that, and I really like that aspect, because I think, like you say, it humanizes it, because it was one of the things I wanted to ask, I guess, because it can be quite, I think, for a newcomer into it, quite imposing to sort of approach this genre that has this history and this weight behind it, that's, or should I say perceived weight. So I was wondering, and again, we can maybe throw this around a bit, what advice would you have for anyone, especially a woman, I suppose, given the context of the book, about approaching Vispo, concrete poetry, whatever, if you wanted to get into it and you were feeling nervous? Would you have any tips?
Talk to me. No, I'm always making all kinds of guides and lists and things. Like I crowdsource all kinds of lists, and a lot of women, actually, some women have sent me and said to me, I've wanted to get into visual poetry. So I give them a few places to start, like a few sites. I'll tell them to go to Wikipedia to read about it too. But and the other thing too is people say, well, for instance, a woman emailed me and said, but I don't know, I don't have the tools and the technology to make visual poetry. And I sent out a list on Twitter and said, how do you make visual poetry? What do you use? And people said, pen and paper work, a cheap scanner, if you want to share it. So we just kind of forget, like I was making visual poetry as a kid long before we knew it was visual poetry. We were all doodling, like because I have grapheme synesthesia, I was always doodling the alphabet, trying to make it the right colors that were in my mind, right? So, I mean, I think that it's more intimidating if you see it in a more of an academic way, but if you think of it as something that's alive. And so I send them to the Wikipedia entry. I send them a few links to some of my like the ones that like different styles and stuff like that. I mean, there should just be a basic like a YouTube video we could all make and just say, this is visual poetry, this is visual poetry, and then well, a little bit like our video in a way that we made for the book. You could talk about the video as well. That's such a great video. I think we should talk about it. So
feel
go
free.
on.
Yeah.
We can put a link in this podcast.
Yeah.
But yeah, the video I thought was really great. That must have been quite a feat to make, considering the logistics of all the poets involved. So, just for some context, they made a lovely video to introduce the book, and it features, I think, is it everyone in the book who's still practicing, pretty much giving a little introduction and a little flavor of themselves in a very short statement. Would that be fair?
It includes some of the women in the book and some women on the bigger list. So that's sort of how we invited women from the book, but we also invited people, women who were also just also on the list. So we have a variety. And at some point it came to me to have them say, I make visual poetry. Because like the title is Making Visual Poetry, and then I said make them in their own language. And Rosaire Appel, who does the scenic writing, she says I make visual poetry in your own language. So I thought that was terrific. I really liked smartasses, so I thought that was really great that she did that. But I mean, and then Joakim, he had some contacts, and you can talk about who actually did the video, because they did a super job on making the video.
I have an old colleague who used to work at a TV station and knows all about cutting video and getting the sound right, which obviously is the most complicated part, because she had to string together some 26 or no, it's more than 30 films, I think, by different women and all kinds of sound qualities and ambience and so on. She had no idea what visual poetry was when she started, and I sent her all the images from the book, and well, she learned by doing, I guess. She made a terrific job. The music is also by a friend of mine who's a musician, whom I more or less forced to make something for us.
This is the darker side now.
You're
getting
the truth now.
and the voiceovers were done by a friend of mine who's also a music teacher and who's done voiceovers before, Jennifer Peterson. So it's really, again, the whole book, we really needed we really did need a village to make the book. We really did need a lot of people to help with the book. Like it's really so many people involved. So, and the video really shows it, I think. And just the idea of visibility again. I mean, I've never seen some of these people. I've never heard them talk. So I was great to see them, put a name to put a sound to the face, and it feels very personal and friendly and approachable. I think that's one of the other things.
Yeah, I think it was great that that repeated message, I make visual poetry. Just that repetition, it's a really strong message. It's like, it felt to me watching it quite liberating, a message, you can do this.
All kinds of women, all ages, from all over the world. I think it's it's brilliant as well. Yeah. I wanted to say something about your question before about what to say about people who don't know about visual poetry and want to learn. I always emphasize that it's very playful, and I think a lot of Vispo is actually, linear poetry can always be this sort of heavy, menacing thing, but Vispo can be very light-hearted as well. Yeah. It can be quite
all the best poetry can be.
Yeah, exactly.
It's a bit like as Johanna says in the foreword to the book, people told her that it wasn't serious enough and it was drawing too much attention to itself. And it's too showy. But that's what poetry can be. It's fine if poetry is that way.
It is showy, and I think that's a good thing about it. I've always loved literature and visual arts equally, and to me, visual poetry is like the perfect combination of the two, really. Mm. And if it's done right, it can contain both great literature and great visuality, if you see what I mean.
And I guess I think one of the beauties of Vispo is it breaks down things like language barriers.
Yes.
Certainly, when you get into the more acemic side of things, you don't necessarily have to be a native speaker to appreciate the message that's being portrayed. You can just appreciate the beauty of the letters and how they're being used and manipulated and displayed, which I think is probably fantastic. So obviously we've got here a Canadian editor and a Swedish publisher, and in your book you've got, gosh, I lose count of the countries that are represented there. It's a fantastic number. I know you've got people from
21 countries, I think.
I could be right. Yeah,
it sounds about right. It was huge. I know there was a huge number. I know you've got like people from India, obviously North America, Canada, all over Europe. It just seemed like a massive number of contributors, which is fantastic.
Yeah, it's great. And it's funny because sometimes that was difficult, not difficult, but just a challenge. Even in communicating in the book. I have my background. I was a French to English translator in another life, and there was at least one of the contributors, she and I would write back and forth to each other in French, and I haven't really been using my French in several decades now, so it was interesting to do that. But she spoke Italian, and I'm an Anglophone, so we found a language that sort of worked mostly for communicating, so that helped as well. But really, it would be nice to have a full budget for things like translation and things like that. So for the next crowdfunding campaign, just kidding.
We need 23 translators.
Yeah, that's right.
It will cost us $100,000 to make this book.
Yeah, I've got to say, it's I know how much work goes into a small anthology, because they're really hard to do.
Yeah.
And so something of the scale that you've achieved, that must have been so much work, and I'm full of admiration.
Yeah.
Are you tired?
Still working on it.
Tired and excited and everything at once, I think.
There needs to be a word for both tired and excited, because I think it's really applicable, because I feel quite exhausted, but also I feel ebullient. So there's we need a sort of
exhausterated.
Exhausted
and exhilarated.
Exhausted.
Yeah, exhausted. Yeah, something. Well, maybe make a visual poem, something. But I mean, the thing is, everyone, again, just to emphasize how everyone has been so great, from all the contributors to people who've helped. We also have a proofreader, an Irish visual poet, Susan Connolly, who's become a great friend of mine in the last year, and she's been great as well. So, it's the sad thing about me is I am so bad and getting worse with names that I think I've spelled everyone's name wrong. So, if I haven't spelled your name wrong yet, just wait for it, because it's going to happen in time. When I was putting up the video the other day on Instagram, I spelled Timglaset wrong. How could you spell that wrong? It was I had an extra S in there somehow. So, yeah, so it's very dangerous, my inability to type names right, or even copy and paste. So I don't know.
I think most of the names are correct at least.
No, thank you. I even spell my own name wrong at times. No, I'm like fast. So I write Adnama or something instead of Amanda. So I don't know.
So obviously this is a really exciting and ambitious project. The scope is absolutely huge. It's a really fantastic looking book, and obviously to do it the justice it deserves, you guys are currently running an Indiegogo campaign for it, which I think is, at time of recording, is on day 2 and is doing fantastically well. And we'll put a link to the campaign in the description of this podcast. But if you'd like to maybe sum up the book and the idea behind the campaign and your intentions, that would be absolutely fantastic.
Who wants to do that?
You want to do that?
I don't know. Well, okay, so the book is it's hopefully it'll be 252 pages. It's what else can we say? It's full color, and it has visual poetry by visual poetry and statements by 23 artists. We already mentioned the foreword by Johanna Drucker and the 3 essays and the round table and the list of over 1,100 women making visual poetry. There's also visual poetry within those essays as well. So that's the book. The crowdfunding campaign is, to raise money, but also it's another aspect of community building as well, and community, not build, but, being part of a community, and to just to have the support for women, and to celebrate. It's part of the celebration and centering of women. And I think even when you go through and read the campaign, just reading even the small, the information there, it's enough to get you excited about the possibilities of the book. And it was interesting writing having to write almost like advertising copy, which I haven't ever done before. So a writer trying to write advertising copy, it's sort of a weird thing. Like they have character limits in their like you can only have so many characters. I'm like, but wait, I want to add an adverb. I need to, so that's it. But I think it's just it makes it very exciting too. To me, it feels very exciting as part of it, but I know I've been getting all kinds of emails and messages, and everyone's really excited. People are sharing it, and it makes me feel like the community is very much in support of it, and I think everyone's looking forward to having it in their hands. We should mention too, we've got all kinds, including one from Clara, great endorsements from many people, and they're also up on the campaign page as well. So you should go and visit that campaign. And there's still some perks left, although the perks have gone pretty fast. There's signed original work by numerous contributors, rare and out of print books as well. So those are great. And you can get an advanced copy of the PDF, the digital, which will be available hopefully in May, and then the actual book itself. So at a discount if you go through the campaign as well. So it's I think that's as close to an advertisement as I can do.
Yeah, I was going to say there's some really great and a fantastic number of like one-off perks people can get for this. Yeah. So, your own piece of Vispo history, you can get it in your hands for and contribute to this fantastic project.
Thanks.
Thank you.
To discover more, visit us at penteractpress.com.